Okay.
Today is February 22nd, 2007, and we are here in the Morrisville Public Library with Mr. Leonard Sullivan, a prominent member of the community. And we're going to talk to him today a little bit about what his life was, early life was like. But first, we're going to begin with his recollections as with the newspaper. And Mr. Sullivan, if you would just go ahead and start off, I'd appreciate it.
All righty. Well, I guess I do qualify as what you call an ink-sting wretch. I worked in newspaper work regularly from 1958 until 1992, and never had a dull day. I mean, I looked forward to going to work every day. It was, it was never, no days were alike, and it was just fun. And this kind of work has got a lot of definitions. One is literature in a hurry, and the only bummer is when the paper comes out and you look at all the errors and what I should have done and all this stuff, but you don't have time. And one of the pleasures I have now, if I'm writing a note to somebody, is I can read it over as many times as I want to. But anyway, one of my favorite stories about newspaper work is Jim Hunt was quarreling with the newspapers one time, and he said, newspaper people, of course today you just say media people, are like the guy who goes up on the hilltop and watches the battle. And when it's over, he goes down and shoots the wounded. So anyway, that's how I got into newspaper work out of Chapel Hill. And I went from Chapel Hill in the summer of 58 to Rocky Mount, North Carolina, on a daily newspaper. And we were there until we came to Mooresville in January of '61. And we didn't know anything about this part of the state, really. And we thought we'd gone to the North Pole because it snowed for three Mondays straight. We had the deepest snow on record or something that year, in 1961. And but anyway, it worked out, and we found a place here. And like everybody else, you start filling in your little places, and you never do know whether you're in a rut or a groove. But we've been here ever since, and couldn't imagine being some other place. It's really nice. But when I was on the Rocky Mount paper, as a daily reporter, I did have a few exposures. For example, things that older people would remember is in Rocky Mount, in Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina, which is up near the Virginia line. This was in '59, I think. They had the first of the labor union riots. The textile people there were trying to get a union organized, and they had to bring out the guard and all that stuff, And they sent me up there to cover that. That was my first exposure to that. And the greatest thing that happened after that was the Rocky Mount paper had a one-man sports department. It was a daily and Sunday paper, and of course all the reporters pitched in to help with features and stuff. But he was involved, somewhere about this time of year, involved in covering the high school basketball playoffs and all that. And he asked me to attend and report the Dixie Classic. Now, that was the first big basketball tournament in North Carolina I'd ever seen. See, every case came and brought basketball to North Carolina. He brought in those Indiana boys, and they just dominated everything. So, and Case established the Dixie Classics. And they would bring in, there was the 4 North Carolina schools and 4 invited schools. And the year I was there happened to be the year that Oscar Robertson was everything at Cincinnati. And Cincinnati was the special guest at the Dixie Classic. And Cincinnati got beat by a state and then got beat by somebody else. Beat twice, and I remember going down to their dressing room, and they come by snorting and cussing and hollered, went in the dressing room, slammed the door, waited about 15 minutes, and they charged out and went to the airport, the bus station or wherever they went, and they never heard from them again. But anyway, covering the Dixie Classic was a big thing back then. And I was really, really uptown at that point. But like I say, we got here in '61, and I was the editor of a once-a-week newspaper. And at that time we had a circulation of about 6,000, and in a town of about 4,000 900, I think, was at least the last previous census. And so that's kind of unusual. I mean, a lot of ours, because I guess half of our circulation was by mail, and people were so accustomed. See, nowadays, if you don't have your paper first thing in the morning, you're all upset. But then everybody knew the paper was available on the street on Wednesday, but everybody waited till Thursday till the mail come to get their paper, and that was fine. And like I was talking about the place of work. Will Everett Jones, I would depend on him to do everything. But one of the stories, something happened, and it was the town board and the school board. I noticed there'd been some recent action about maybe one of them not meeting on the first Monday night of the month. But see, back then they met on the first Monday night, both of them, and it was just me. And something serious was going on that particular night, I remember, and I asked Everett if he would go and cover the town board while I was at the school board. I don't know what they were hiring, new something. Anyway, I felt we had to be there. He said, yeah, and he didn't drive, so I took him to the town hall, and then I went to the school board. And he went ahead, and that was an early item. So I was only there about 30 minutes, I guess, and I said, well, I'll go see what Everett's doing. And I went over to the town hall in the commissioner's room, and bless his heart, he was fast asleep sitting there in the meeting, fast asleep. So I just drove him home, and I never did ask him to do anything to help me after that. And probably Tom McKnight was the founder of the Mooresville Tribune. He got it going about 1932. And he probably was the sharpest man that you... In other words, he's the kind of guy, if you start telling him something and you see him kind of glaze over, it's almost impossible to tell him anything he didn't already know. You know, he's that type of person. And when we came to Mooresville, we're talking Iredell County in 1961, his advice to me was, he said, Iredell is a long, narrow county, and it's culturally and socially divided. And he said, you be real careful. Don't ever trust in them people above Carr's Branch. Now, you know where Carr's Branch is. It's right there where 77 comes across 21. So everybody up above that was the bad guys. And of course, it was basically true, because they were all dairy farmers and didn't have any industry, and they didn't want taxes and everything like that. And of course, the Long family then, their names were Long. They had dominated county politics for so long, and Tom had alienated all of them because he learned that they were, back then you had county roads, and the county maintained roads. And they had a few drag lines and ditch cleaning equipment and all that. And the Long people apparently had considered they could use the county equipment. So Tom got a photographer to go there and make pictures of them clearing land and using the county equipment for their own personal use, and got that stopped. And then they didn't have anything else to do with Tom. So, but and he told me, if I wanted to learn anything about Mooresville, if I wanted to know what's going on in Mooresville, I had to go up to the First National Bank of Mooresville and talk to Onai Houston. He was the man to talk to. And if I had a problem about the business community, I went to Mr. A.C. Craven at Belt. And he'd take care of that part of it, And as far as politics, of course, it was all Democrat then. It was everything Republican, but it was all Democrat then. And it amazed me because he had a system set up. Tom was active in politics, and he had a system set up whereby he and Roy Coggins, who had the taxi cab service, among them, they could figure out who to go get to take to the polls, and they could project the outcome of a local election at that point within 50 votes anytime. They knew what was going to happen because they took the polls there to make it happen. like I said, we do have 3 sons, and the third son, Lee, he even today he likes to. The other 2 sons were born. One was born in Washington, one was born in Chapel Hill. And Lee was born here, so even today he likes to kid his brothers, said, "You guys are come here, but I'm born here." Yeah, and we always, back in those days, the War Memorial was built, but the gymnasium was not built. So if you played like recreation basketball, you played in what we call the old bowling alley, which was sort of back of Broad Street. But it's, where the TV, the cable TV. Okay, it was sort of back of that, and it was owned by the mill, and had been used as the bowling alley, but now it was a gymnasium. And we all played there, played ball there, and everything. But then summers. Later on, we began to go to Mond Street. I don't know whether anyone is familiar with Mond Street. We were doing that. It's a delicate thing now. But the things that you remember is, you guys weren't here when the decision was made simply to integrate the schools, one shot, bang, bang, like that. And I was always impressed at how well it went for Mooresville. And it was done that way because we had because we had a powerful superintendent of schools, and we had some real strong clergymen at that time, and they all agreed, we want to do this thing right, and basically they did. And I remember, that Rufus Dalton was an industrialist here. He owned 2 of those plants out on the bypass, and it's now offices, but on Church Street, past the newspaper on the right where those offices are, that was a mill. And Rufus and he only hired black people. He staffed that mill with black workers, and that was that he wanted to give the people a bump, and he did. And we had a pastor, talking about the active clergyman. We had a pastor at the First Presbyterian Church here, he was a come here too. But anyway, he said the way we do this thing we just built a swimming pool at the War Memorial. We'll have days for white people and days for black people. And that didn't go over too swiftly, with either race, But the idea was they were all trying to make it work out for everybody, and the school people were a big help, and they did. And another thing along those times is my wife reminded me about it. I don't think we have a foreign exchange program anymore for the high school, but along about that time, about the late '60s, the Junior Civic League got interested in bringing exchange students here, and Bess Jefford was a great civic worker, and my wife was in the club, and I think they were sort of the ringleaders in bringing foreign students here, and they every year for 15 years or so, we'd always do a story about the student coming and then the student going, and it was a real binder for the community. Everybody could relate to that, and we'd have a little supper for everybody, but I do think that and I think Selma Burke has been talked about a lot. Of course, she was a great person, and just a loving person, but her glasses redefined Coke bottle bottoms. I mean, you couldn't see anything in her eyes through her glasses. She really needed some help with her glasses. But she was a member of an outstanding family. She grew up at Cascade, and her sister was married to a Mr. Miller, who was the principal of the black school over at Amity Hill, and his wife was a teacher. And their son was a boy genius, George Mason Miller. He probably, in your stuff, you probably heard of George Mason Miller. Okay, he finished high school at 15. He graduated from college at 19. He went on to teach at one of the colleges in New York, and just a brilliant guy. come by the paper when he visited his mama, and I'd enjoy talking to him. Just things you remember. And like I said, the ministers seem to be more pumped up and more involved in the community, and that's normal because there's just so much more to do now. See, when I'd go down streets in Mooresville in the '60s, if I saw somebody that I didn't know, I'd say, "Where you come from? What are you doing here? Who are you? You might want to put something in the paper about you." And now I go downstairs, and if I see somebody I know, I go and grab them and hug them. It's so different, But I was thinking about people. The minister, and I got one story on Jeter Porch. He was pastor of Berea Baptist Church out here on 150, and just a great person. But he was he was North Carolina mountains all the way. And Berea, when the lake came and all the new people came, Berea basically just outgrew Jeter. And they knew it, and he knew it. But they just couldn't put him out to pasture. So they worked through the Baptist associations and got him some kind of church, or a church, down among the Lumbee Indians. We know where the Lumbees are. And Jeter got gone. And I didn't, everybody sort of forgot about him. And he had been the self-appointed police department chaplain. If any policeman, had a problem, he would always be there, visit the hospital. He was just a great pastor. But I went by the police station about a year and a half after Jeter left, and there he sat, back in the police department. And I spoke to him, and I said, "Wow, good to see you." I said, "You've been away a while." He said, "Yeah, but I'm back." And I said, "Well, how'd everything go?" He said, "Well, I learned one thing." I said, "What was that?" He said, "The Lord will call you as far east as Raleigh, and He'll send you the rest of the way." And the other, of course, we had a lot of good leaders. Joe Knox, of course, is the most decisive leader the community's ever had. He was commissioner 10 years and mayor 30 years or something. And you could depend on Joe. I mean, he would tell you no as good as just as easy as he'd tell you yes. He didn't meal him out, And but my favorite story about Johnny Miller was mayor at one time, and of course Clyde Towell was mayor briefly, but they both went to these meetings, at Chapel Hill, the Institute of Government, and all that. And Johnny likes to tell the story. I like to tell the story about Clyde. He said Clyde had a growth in his nose. I don't know what, but he had to go about every 2 or 3 years and have this thing cut out of his nose. And while it was getting up big, I mean, it made an awful noise, And Johnny said they were rooming together, and said Clyde was, and said he was rattling the Venetian blinds, And Johnny said, I punched him, I said, Clyde, turn over. And said, Clyde, he said, Johnny, I'm on my good side now. Yeah, okay. And about Long Sam and Dorothy Brown, that happened in the summer of 1957. Of course, we were not here, but in fact, we were at Chapel Hill at the time. But it became Mooresville's, before all the NASCAR stuff, it became Mooresville's 15 minutes of fame. The publisher of the paper, Tom McKnight, and a photographer for the paper, Fletcher Davis. He had a studio here, but we didn't have a full-time photographer, but we'd call him on special things. When the dam was being built, Duke Power had already determined the 760 high water line and had published maps showing exactly where the lake shoreline, the 530 miles of lake shoreline would be, and were taking applications to lease lots, lakefront lots. See, but they weren't selling any lots then. You could just lease a lot, but the lease was, worth less than the taxes it would be even then. So it was a real bargain. So Tom had gone out with his photographer on a road out, you know where Big Daddy's restaurant is? Okay, there's a road that turns, right before you get to Big Daddy's parking lot, there's a road that turns down toward the water. And they were down there and looking at they had the map with them, trying to see how the lots were running and all that. And they came up on a wood structure, and Fletcher saw this girl at the well, drawing water from a well. And she had on cut-off black jeans and a shirt, sleeve with the knot, up here and the knot with a bare midriff and all that. And Fletcher went berserk, but he made a bunch of pictures and all this stuff. And they come back to the office, and she and her family had moved here about 3 years previously from somewhere in the mountains. Her daddy was a woodcutter, and see, at that point in time, Duke was hiring anybody that had a saw to help clear the lake bottom. See, they had thousands and thousands of acres of trees and stumps and everything to clear out of the lake before the water came up. And it went on for about 5 years. So that's what they were doing there in some rented house. And her given name was Dorothy Brown. And anyway, at that time, Case Gary was a columnist for the Charlotte Observer. I don't know whether Case died in the past several years, but he was nationally known as a newspaper columnist. He was humorous, and philosophical and all that. And he and Tom corresponded a lot because he was always looking for column ideas, and he'd call Tom, and they knew each other. So Tom, in the next issue of the paper, ran a column called "The Girl in Black," and he just talked about finding finding the girl and all that, and ran a little head and shoulder shot of her on that page, and then inside he ran a picture of her at the well with all this stuff, and it was pretty racy for its time, but anyway, there was something that sort of caught your eye. And so O'Kays saw it in the More Tom's paper and called him, and one thing led to another. And then about a week later, he devoted his column to Tom's story. But, see, Al Capp did Little Abner. Everybody knows Little Abner, but Little Abner got a little stale and things moved along, so he came up with another comic strip called Long Sam. And it was a Little Abner type person, woodsy country, but it was a vivacious woman. I mean, really stacked, you know what I'm saying? And all short, just like that. And Case Gary looked at the picture and he said, well, that's Long Sam. So that's how Dorothy Brown became Long Sam. And see, at that time, the Charlotte Observer was a night newspaper. And as soon as Gary's column came out, of course, all the other night newspapers, they all trade all their stuff. So all the night newspapers picked up his column, and then the TV got a hold of it. So that was the story began in July the 25th when Tom's column came out, and this kept building up until in August. Anyway, it was about the latter part of August. They had pictures in the newspaper she had never seen the ocean. So she and the photographer go to the ocean, and they come back with all these pictures in her swimsuit, and all this stuff. And see, the summertime in newspaper business, certainly with weekly newspaper stuff, when school's out, it's the news doldrums. There's not much going on. I mean, you look for a big chicken or something, to make a story out of. I remember one summer, this to tell you how hard up you can get. A guy he was a roofer out here towards Shepherd, and he had a pet buzzard. And we did a big story about his pet buzzard, and I said, how low can you go, But I mean, and it wasn't that type of thing, and yet it was. There wasn't enough hard news, going on so you were looking for all kinds of features. Long Sam was just perfect for that. It just hit just right. So anyway, one thing led to another, and she wound up on the Ed Sullivan show one Sunday night, and we had got our secondhand TV when we were living in Chapel Hill, and that was the first time we'd ever heard Mooresville mentioned anywhere, and of course she went on, and to sort of sum the whole thing up, Tom became her legal guardian because when all the trees were cleared out and everything, her family went back to Wilkes County or Allegheny or somewhere, and basically she was 17 at the time and had quit school. Tom became her legal guardian, and some man in Charlotte actually paid for her education. She went to Salem to finish high school, and then she went to Women's College in Greensboro and got a degree and taught school and went on and did real wonders. And in fact, the Love family that owned Burlington Industries at one time, she married into that family later on. And she's everything went well, but I don't think the marriage lasted. But she still lives in Charlotte somewhere. But that was a summer, to remember for Mooresville. And the other story had to do with Sue Ellen Evans that I thought we'd try to make a mention of. Sue Ellen, her family lived out north of Mooresville on the Shenville Road, where you turn to the right there, what we call, lived out there a little ways. Her dad worked at the post office. Her dad was named Glenn, and she worked at the post office. And Juanita Davis was the fashion woman's editor, and everything in the paper. And so she did home economic stuff, and we'd go out and make pictures. And of course, we knew the family because they were active in that. Anyway, she went to Catawba College, I think, for a year, and then she went to Women's College for a short time. And she was at Chapel Hill that summer doing a little catch-up work so she could continue her studies in the fall, and she planned to earn a degree there at Chapel Hill. And she was just walking across campus from one place to another through this arboretum and was attacked and stabbed. And as it happened, another person who was in summer school there, Barbara Sullivan, oddly enough, she was a nun from Belmont Abbey, and she was also walking that same path in the arboretum and heard Sue Ellen scream, and went there and saw a man run away from her. And she said she saw a man's arm around the girl's neck, and then when she yelled, the guy ran away. And anyway, she got to her, and said when she got to her, she was looking real odd, and she managed to say, "He tried to rape me." And then she collapsed and died right there in her arms. And to this day, they said they found some skin under her fingernails, and they found some hair in her textbook somewhere or another that was not her hair. But the Chapel Hill Police Department, the SBI, and everybody has never been able to. The case is not solved ever. It's a sad thing. And it was so personal to me because I knew her dad, and he was just completely devastated. He just could not deal with it, and he died within a couple of years after she was killed. But her brother's still he's not well either, but he's still living and everything. But some of the things that my nose is running in. Yeah, we were talking, sort of summing up things. We went to press on Wednesdays, and we had to try to get the paper on the street for sale by noon on Wednesdays. And of course, you always contact all the law enforcement people, that morning and try to get up to date as much as you can because you don't have much time to get to do the rest of it. And one Wednesday morning, we were calling around, and one of the deputy sheriffs, bless his heart, Tom Thompson, who was one of the Mooresville Thompsons, was a deputy at that time. And he said, "Well, I think you need to come out here to Barger Construction Company," which was one of the biggest general contractors in North Carolina. And we went out it was out on 21, right there at the end of West Wilson Avenue. The big office was there. And the second in command of Barger Construction Company had come to work, walked around the back of the building with a double-barrel shotgun, and just blew himself away. He was out there. And he was a fine man, and nobody ever figured out, why this happened. There were a lot of talk. What had happened, that everybody sort of keyed on, is Barger Construction Company had got the contract to build an addition the Keenan Stadium in Chapel Hill. Had 2 or 3 decks and all that stuff. And unfortunately, when they didn't read the fine print, they learned after they got the contract that they could not put any equipment on the playing field. And they had to be, the humongous concrete columns had to go up there, and they had to spend a bunch of money to bring in special cranes and everything to lift everything from back outside the stadium into the stadium. So the job was running way late. And of course, JR was the head of everything, at that point. And so the stress fell on him primarily. And in addition to that, they had anyway, there's a word for it in the trade, but the agreement was if for every new seat that you don't have ready by the first football game, you have to buy that. So you have to pay that ticket. You have to pay the cost of that ticket. And they were adding maybe 12,000 seats in that place. So that would have been a knock too. So they set up 24-hour work crews, working day and night, hiring football players after practice and everything to push wheelbarrows and stuff. And they made the deadline. And it worked out fine. They did a great job and all that. But the people who just knew J.R. Marks said, well, maybe he just got overstressed, with that job or something. And then the guys in the Rotary Club said that J.R. just wanted to be a district governor so bad. But I can't imagine a guy wanting to be a district governor that bad. Anyway, that was one of the things that stick to your mind. And then to mention the Banks Carr of Mooresville. The Carr family spread out pretty good. One Carr was mayor of Raleigh for a while, and one Carr was a big car dealership there. And Banks started the Carr drug chain. So the Harris Teeter supermarkets everybody is familiar with, but not everybody today will remember that Willis Teeter and his brother Bill Teeter both lived out here in 150 around Prospect Church. And they had a little store here on Main Street called Teeter's. And then they opened a second store in Hickory. And one thing led to another. And the fellow Harris, whose first name I don't recall, had a few grocery stores in Charlotte. So in 1960, the two merged, became Harris Teeter. And I think... And Buddy Higgins, a good friend of ours, who had been with the Teeters while it was Teeters, he was manager of the store here, he can take credit for being the manager of the first Harris Teeter. Now, he said there may have been a Harris Teeter opened in Charlotte before they opened one here, but it'd be a matter of days or weeks. But he likes to, he was the manager of the first 10. He's retired and lives over on Pinewood Circle, he and his wife. And he was with the company 30 odd years. But just you don't, things move on, things change, and you don't really. We're talking about the lake now. We were trying to put another spin on the lake. See, there again, construction I think started about 1955 for the dam itself. Building the causeways and all that stuff. And when Tom called me in Rocky Mountain and told us to come talk to him about coming here, he began sending me copies of the paper. And I remember one of the issues that I got while we still lived in Rocky Mount was when they were closing the gates. And that would be the late fall of 1960. And it would take, they say, somewhere between 2 or 3 years for the lake to fill. And we got here in Mooresville in 61. To give you an example, on Perth Road, if you go out Perth Road, that big pumping station that's right beside the bridge? Okay. We got pictures of our boys playing in the sand under that pump station. There wasn't anything there but a little old stream about 20 feet across. Just it wasn't a creek or anything. It was just, and it was sitting there on high and dry like a silo. No water hardly in sight. And of course now it's in about 50 feet of water. And the old 150 bridge, we used to go, when you cross over into Catawba County, you went across the bridge. And then here came this bridge, looked like 200 feet above the other bridge. And that was the bridge that's there now. The water at the bridge on 150 is almost 200 feet deep. Almost as deep as it is at the dam itself, which is right at 200 feet. And but to back up a little bit, after Duke acquired the land, and there were a few smart people, and they're still around, who didn't get mesmerized by the money. They saw what was happening, or their lawyer did, or somebody. And they only sold the water rights. They didn't sell the land. Now, you're talking about all this economic development stuff around the lake. The people who kept the land and sold the water rights, now they are the ones who have done well, really well. You imagine owning a half mile on Lake Norman in 1996 or something, And I know people who actually did that. But to kind of give a chronological perspective, as I understand it, once they established the 760 high water mark, they just drew a map of what the lake shore line would look like. And one of the issues that Tom sent to me, his whole front page on the paper, not just part of it, the whole page was that map, where people could actually see where they lived and see where the lake shore was in relation. And they were taking applications. I don't know whether you had to go to Charlotte or the Duke Power office or where, but you could just apply. You could pick a spot. And I guess it was the first come, first served thing. If you picked a lot here before somebody else did, then you got to lease that lot. And of course, all of them were leased. Obviously over a period of time. And the first summer we were here, of course, you didn't even know there was no lake. And by the second summer, you could see the water. If you went out, you could see the water coming. And by the summer of '63, people were out in boats then. And that was the year that they started running into floating stumps and logs and everything else. But of course, they had to clean up. They had people available just to take care of those things as they happened. Pick up the stumps and all that. But I'd say as a playground, as the thing it is today, it was about 1964 or so before it just became what we know it today. And of course, back then, you could ride out in the lake and see miles of trees along the sides. You didn't see houses back then, But then and how we got involved, we live on the lake, and how we got involved, we, sometime in the late 70s, a couple who had a leased lot just wanted to go back to Ohio. Why anybody want to go back to Ohio, I have no idea. That's like going back to West Virginia, isn't it? But anyway, we learned about it, and what you do, you buy their lease. See, you buy, if they got Duke Power lets you build a house on a leased lot, and you own the house, but they own the land. And so we had a little cottage on it, so we wound up buying their, and this was in the late 70s, and I think we bought the lease and the lot for like $14,000 or something.
Wow.
Yeah. And and then what happened was Mecklenburg County was growing, had less shoreline in Ireland, but they were growing faster because they had water and sewer. And they wanted, and the Mecklenburg County ordinance said, if you have a street, you got to have curb and gutter. And Duke Power had been cutting streets to all the lake access lots, doing that at their own expense. And they said, well, we're going to do that, Rather than spend the extra money to meet the standards, they decided to sell the lease lots. So they're 20-year leases anyway, And so sometime in the late 70s, they offered nearly all their lots. I don't know if it was all of them, or nearly all their lots. The person who held a lease had the first refusal on buying the lot. So, if you could possibly come up with the money, you bought the lot, So, and now I don't think I think all the leases have expired. So I don't think there are any more leased lots on the lake. But the market's still out there apparently. Yeah. But that's about the time frame involved in the lake filling.
You talked about when they dammed up, or they put the dam in before the water started coming down. Was the river stopped also?
No, they built little canals around
for the river.
The water kept going
down south.
Yeah, they were able to, and you see those. They don't. It's not a bulkhead. The approaches to the dam itself, they had waterways cut through there, and then they just filled them back up when they closed the dam off.
What was the community's feeling when they put the dam in? Was everyone for it, or was there a mixed bag, or people raise up against it?
I think, like I say, we're not here until later, but I think the general feeling was the economic opportunity is obvious. I think everybody could see that. But there was a certain amount of misgiving, because right where the dam is built is where the Battle of Cowan's Ford was fought. So all that's underwater now, And a friend of mine who had a Skipper's Landing on Perth Road, he established that and ran it. And before the lake filled, he spent a couple of years picking up Indian relics all over the river shore. And even today, I think, if you go visit the dam, go inside the dam, they have a room set aside for his stuff. He's got tomahawks and arrowheads and just about everything you can imagine that the Indians used along the riverbank. And I imagine today that the collection, wherever it is, has a lot of value.
Now, the land that was flooded, was that rich farmland, or was that just bottomless gravel land?
It's difficult to describe it as rich farmland, because it was hilly, up and down. And see, when the water came up, it just filled up the lower parts, So most of what the water filled, they referred to, it was cultivatable land, and mostly was in corn and stuff like that, and pasture, but it didn't have any particular value. It wasn't, as agricultural land. The acre value was not that much. But in fact, after I was working years, it was so sad, because I don't know whether today, and of course it's for several years, Iredell County and most other counties, in order to set the value of properties, they set up taxing grids. I think Iredell has about 100 and some. And that means, and the reason the way they determine the value is what is bought and sold in your grid. And for years, half a dozen old couples, even older than I am now, probably, would come by the paper, basically in tears, and with their tax bill. And they had the same little old frame house, with a porch and a well and all that. And the value of their property had quadrupled, because people come around them and built $200 and $300 houses all around them. So they were in that grid, and their value went up. It seems unfair, but I don't know how you do it in a fair way. If you can keep your land zoned agricultural and don't develop it, but still the grids are some size. So like where we are, we have a basic house, but there's high dollar houses in our grid. So if somebody came along and offered us the tax value on our place, I think we'd be gone.
I'd like to know what the tax value on our house is.
Yeah, but was that sort of what you were talking about?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay.
We were talking about, how the hours and everything with a weekly newspaper. The average person who, say, comes here from a city and is used to the paper being on the porch every morning. It's a whole different world. What do you do with one newspaper a week? Anyway, I was just the first month I was in work, and I happened to be walking by the front desk, and this elderly person came in, elderly person, and said, I happened to see her. I said, "Could I help you?" She said, "Well, yes." Said, I want the local newspaper." Said, "What time in the morning should I expect my paper?" And I said, "Well, we're not a morning paper." She said, "Oh, you're afternoon." I said, "Well, yeah, we are, but..." And she said, "Well, what time in the afternoon?" I said, "Well, it's just one afternoon." I said, "We have one paper a week. Wednesday is our press day." And she looked at me like this, and she said, "You just have one paper a week?" I said, "Well, yes, ma'am." And she said, "Well, young man, do you work here?" I said, "Well, yes, ma'am." And she said, "Well, what is your regular job?" And my regular job was being there from 8 o'clock in the morning till midnight, 3 days a week, and then regular hours, off and on the rest of the time. But, and you can imagine how long that's been when she said, "Young man, can you remember how long?" Yeah. Okay, what else?
You had talked a little bit about coming up as a child and working on the farm and going to school.
Yeah.
Can you kind of go back over what you?
You mean at the beginning of everything?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. When like I said, I was on tobacco farms, tenant tobacco farms, and of course, we had school buses even back then, so you rode to school. And I went to Bass High School, which was about 7 miles one way, and Washington was about 7 or 8 miles the other way. But kids in the country, all they know is baseball. Everything is to do with baseball. And so it was just a natural, if you didn't play baseball, you were gay or something, So I did credit baseball with enabling me to go to college. I didn't get a scholarship. I got sort of a half-ass scholarship, I got to stay they gave me a bunk in the basement of the gymnasium, and gave me a job in the chow hall. So I could do that. And bless their heart, the baseball coach, back then they had, it looked like books of coupons, but we call them chow books, and they were worth $5 a piece. And so you could eat breakfast for $0.25, and I think lunch was 40 cents in the cafeteria. So a $5 chow book, that was a big deal. And this coach, I guess I looked hungry or something, but he'd see him on the campus, and he'd just slip me a chow book every once in a while. But that kept me alive while I was in school. And then that was at East Carolina. And then when I came out of the Army, I was drafted one summer, and I came out of the Army, I went to Chapel Hill. And of course, we were married then, and my wife got a job with the Hospital Savings Corporation, which now is Blue Cross Blue Shield there in Chapel Hill. And I worked in the news bureau, and we had that way we had the GI Bill, see. So we could, if we were careful with saving our bottles and getting our refund on our bottles and stuff, we were able to do it. Yeah. And one of our things I remember is I was working with the news bureau, and of course the people there knew my situation. Knew we had 2 sons and still staying in school. So they sent a photographer over to we lived in veterans housing. I think the rent was $15 a month or something. Called it Victory Village in Chapel Hill. Now the hospital covers everything. There's no Victory Village there anymore. The hospital covers everything there. But they sent a photographer over there, and I put on my necktie and sat on the couch and held the boys, and they sent it out to all the newspapers in the state. And I don't know how many. A lot of them used it, but I don't know. It was unusual at that time. There were married people in school, but it was unusual at that time for married people with children, trying to make it in school. So does that sort of address what you were talking about? And of course, I was fortunate to have at the School of Journalism. Of course, I was working in the news bureau. I was fortunate enough to have a professor who was sort of semi-retired. He owned a newspaper in Montana and one up in Farmville, Virginia, Lewistown, Montana, and one in Farmville, Virginia. And he appreciated community newspapers. And I guess he saw something in me that I didn't see. So when we were in Rocky Mount and the job in Mooresville came open, the publisher called the School of Journalism and asked for references. So because he was a once-a-week paper, I assumed they asked Professor Byerly, who was my dear friend, and he recommended me. And I knew, otherwise I'd still be in Rocky Mount, go down to the police station every morning, I reckon. But that's really how we got to be here, because when Tom called, and he invited us to come up and just look at the city. He wanted to see me and wanted, go through the usual things. So Lou and I, and what was funny, see, we were in Chapel Hill, and Morrisville is where where Morrisville is. We're not near the airport. And we left Rocky Mounts, we're going to Mooresville, and we kept going and kept going and kept going. And she thought we were going back to the southern part of heaven, right there in Morrisville. And we came all the way to Mooresville. Yeah.
Well, can you tell us the story about how much you enjoyed FFA in school?
I can't think of anything positive about FFA. The only thing I can remember, and this sounds a little cruel, you ever involved in a belt line? Okay, if the teacher got ready to whack you those days, she whacked you. With a wooden paddle or whatever she had handy, a ruler or anything, And the FFA guys, if you messed up in FFA, you ran the belt line. You got the kid; they had their belts, and you run and they watched you when you went by. And I had to stand in line once, but I didn't swing at anybody. I never had to run the belt line. But it was just so. You didn't learn anything new in FFA. In other words, the guy knew he was secure in his job, getting paid by both governments, but there is a little side story to that. He played what we call Class D baseball. He played baseball at NC State when he was there studying there, the FFA teacher, and then he played a little class, and he knew baseball. So the year that I quit his outfit, you had to walk by his building to go to the baseball field. And I guess it was about late in the fall, and I was walking over to go to practice or something. It wasn't fall, but of course. Anyway, I was walking by his building, and I saw him come out of the building. And I said, "Oh Lord, what's this? He's coming after me." And he came out there with a baseball bat, and he just walked to the thing and stuck it out like that, and said, "Here, see if you can hit anything with this." And it turned out to be a bat he had used when he was playing pro ball.
Wow.
So, you get the feeling that maybe this kid did the right thing for himself, And anyway, that's the impression I got out of it. And he was, I guess the number of boys he had enrolled in FFA had some sort of bearing on his pay, but, it would be so insignificant. I don't think he was worried about the loss of one guy. And bless his heart, I just, bookkeeping on feeding a hog just didn't seem to be something you'd want to do.
Are there any other stories that you'd like to include on your?
Well, I think I've been through my whole list. I think we were talking, to clear things up about the Everett Jones, more item about Everett Jones. He was, like I said, his definition, he was a bachelor, and his definition of a bachelor, that's a guy who had never made the same mistake once. But he used to tell these stories about when the Class D Mooresville, they had professional baseball. And, they had a couple of Hall of Famers pass through that ballpark over there. And the Stone Street's Cafe used to be the gathering place down in front of the mill. It's not even there now. The mill finally got rid of it. But Everett talks about sitting out there, they had some kind of speaker hooked up with the radio in the cafe, and people would gather up there on the railroad bank just to hear the ball game when they were out of town, And he told stories about a guy named Bud Foster, He was a world champion eater. He had according to Everett, he had a standing bet that, what amount of, maybe for a steak or something. But he said he could put a quart of mustard to his mouth and drink that quart of mustard without ever taking the jar down. And his favorite trick at Fieldstone Cafe, he would come in and eat a steak, and then he would round up all the steak bones from the other people and put on his plate. And then when somebody came in, he'd challenge them and say, I'll bet you so much I could eat another steak. You know, it was a trip. And the thing about the guy, it was in 57, the same year, earlier the same year, a guy had been missing for a number of years. And something, heavy rain or something, out on a big sawdust pile out on Cottle Creek Road, exposed his skeleton in that sawdust pile. And they identified him as a guy had been killed a couple of years before in some poker game or something. And they arrested another guy and convicted him. But Everett because it shows Everett, the picture that ran in the paper when you look back in the old issue of the paper. The sheriff is standing over here on the sawdust pile, and Everett's standing here with his notebook, you know. And he was on the front page. So no wonder he liked to tell about the guy on the sawdust pile. Oh, boy.
Well, Mr. Sullivan, we certainly do appreciate you coming in and talking with us today and sharing some of these wonderful stories that you have about your early life and also about what the newspaper business was like in Mooresville. So thank you very much for joining us.
Well, it's been fun.